My name is Stacy West. I am the IRB Reliance Specialist at Virginia Commonwealth University, and today we're going to talk about submitting Reliance requests to the VCU HRPP and some of the tips for success to prevent extended delays in your request. So we'll go over some definitions, when it is appropriate to rely on an external institution, the different types of agreements and IRBs that you might encounter, how to submit a request, what I will look at during the screening process, and this includes things like ancillary reviews. We'll talk a little bit about common problems that we come across during the screening process, and then finally what I can do to help you get through this a little quicker. So what is a reliance? Well, IRB reliance is when one IRB agrees to rely on the IRB review, approval, and ongoing oversight from another IRB. An example is VCU typically relies on Western IRB for all of our industry-sponsored research, but reliance agreements are not limited to commercial IRBs. VCU can rely or review on behalf of another institution, but in this presentation, we're going to focus specifically on instances where VCU is relying on an external IRB. So some important terms for you to know. Single IRB or SIRB refers to the review of research occurring at multiple sites by a single IRB. An IRB that agrees to accept the review, approval, or ongoing oversight from another IRB is the relying site. So in most of the instances we're talking about today, VCU would be the relying site. The reviewing IRB, also called the IRB of record, the central IRB, or the single IRB, is the IRB that agrees to conduct a review of human subjects research on behalf of another entity. And a reliance agreement is the legal agreement that outlines the terms of the reliance agreement. This should address the specific responsibilities of both the reviewing and the relying institution. There are some instances when it is appropriate for VCU to rely on an external IRB. Industry-sponsored research is almost always going to go to Western IRB or another commercial IRB like Advara. Multi-site research in some instances is required to use a single IRB, so this would include your NIH-funded research on or after January 25th, 2018, or anything that receives HHS funding on or after January 20th, 2020. If all of the research activities are occurring at another site, for example, VCU is only assisting with data analysis, or if we're the direct recipient of award, but the actual research is occurring elsewhere, it may be appropriate for us to rely on that external IRB's review. And there may also be other justifications. If it's minimal risk research and you have several collaborators, and you just want to ensure that the review is consistent and you don't have multiple consent forms across the different sites, that could also potentially be a valid justification for VCU to rely externally. There are some instances, as I mentioned, where single IRB review is required. So single IRB is going to be required when you have NIH-funded research where the solicitation was issued after January 25th, 2018, and none of the exceptions apply, or HHS-supported research after January 20th, 2020, where exceptions do not apply. Single IRB is not required if the HHS-funded research was approved before January 20th, 2020, if the NIH single IRB policy does not apply and the research was approved before January 20th, 2020, if the NIH granted an exemption from the single IRB policy before January 20th, 2020, if the research is not cooperative, or if there are sites that require local review, like tribal review or certain state laws that might prohibit single IRB. There are also instances where the funding agency may determine that single IRB is not appropriate, and in those cases, it's also not required. There are some cases where VCU will not rely on an external IRB. So if the proposed reviewing IRB does not meet VCU standards, for example, if there is a history of investigation or reports, or if the institution is not AHRP accredited and their policies are not comparable to the VCU policies. VCU is an AHRP accredited IRB, and in order to maintain that accreditation, we do have to set certain parameters around when we can and cannot rely on external institutions. So if another institution is not AHRP accredited and you're interested in relying on them, we have to do a little digging into their policies to ensure that theirs are comparable to ours in relation to the research that you're doing. If the proposed IRB doesn't have adequate expertise, VCU is not going to be able to rely. An example of this might be prisoner research, where the reviewing IRB doesn't have experience reviewing prisoner research or doesn't have a prisoner representative. At this time, the VCU IRB cannot rely on the VA, and the VA does not rely on the VCU IRB. This is something that is currently being discussed. There may be changes to that policy in the very near future, but at this time, VCU does not rely on the VA. A reliance arrangement is also not going to be appropriate if single IRB is not otherwise mandated and the majority of the research activities are occurring at VCU. In any case, the VCU HRPP will consider the risk level of the research and applying restrictions. It's also generally not expeditious to rely on an external IRB if there's an exempt determination. Exempt determinations are potentially going to take as long or longer for reliance review as they would just to get that exempt determination from VCU. There are some other considerations. The NIH did explicitly exclude exempt research from their single IRB requirement. However, HHS has been silent on this. Under the new 2018 Common Rule categories, we have exempt with limited IRB review, and there are a lot of questions about whether that research is subject to the single IRB requirement. Again, OHRP has not commented on this yet. Until then, VCU is operating under the assumption that exempted research does not require single IRB. NIH has previously defined cooperative research as research where each of the institutions are conducting the same protocol. This was open to interpretation, and there were a lot of different interpretations about what that meant. But the Common Rule requirement defines cooperative research as those covered by this policy that involve more than one institution. This is also a little confusing to interpret because Virginia is a state that has to apply the Common Rule to all research. We are at this time interpreting this to mean projects that are funded by a federal agency and not all projects that are subject to the Common Rule requirement, mostly because that is impracticable for VCU to implement. Other sponsors may require single IRB review. This should be something that's disclosed to you when you respond to the RFP. There are different types of agreements. VCU currently has master agreements with NCI Central, WERB, and Advara. We're also signed on to the Smart IRB Joinder Agreement. As a point of clarification, Smart IRB is a platform and an agreement. It is not an IRB. We also have our standard institutional authorization agreement. So if we do not have a master agreement in place and the institution you're interested in working with is not signed on to Smart IRB, VCU does have a template agreement that we prefer to use. We also have what's called a collaborating organization agreement. This agreement is specific to organizations that do not hold an FWA, but are interested in partnering with VCU collaborators. In that instance, a collaborating organization agreement extends our FWA to cover the research activities happening at this site that does not hold an FWA. There are also different kinds of IRBs. So we've mentioned a couple of times commercial IRBs. These are for-profit entities that are not related to any academic institution. Academic IRBs, like the VCU IRBs, are associated with an academic institution. And then there's the NCI Central IRB, which is required for certain studies supported by NCI. Master agreements document the reliance agreement between institutions for any study, so these are not study-specific. As such, they do not require a study-specific institutional authorization agreement. A master agreement is implemented whenever VCU relies on Western IRB, and for this reason, Western IRB's institutional compliance screenings tend to move a little faster because there's no requirement to negotiate terms of an institutional authorization agreement. VCU currently has master agreements in place with Western IRB, NCI Central, and Advara. VCU is also signed on to the Smart IRB agreement. This agreement can be documented through an emailed letter of acknowledgement, the Smart IRB online platform, or IRB Exchange, also known as IRX. Our standard institutional authorization agreement, which is used when SMART is not applicable, may require legal review, and this is something you should take under consideration when building out your timelines. If we are working with an institution we've not worked with before, there is the potential that the institutional authorization agreement may have to go through their general counsel, or if they propose an agreement that is different from ours, it may have to go through our general counsel, and this can extend the amount of time it takes to execute an agreement. And then we have the collaborating organization agreement, which extends the VCU FWA to cover another entity. There are some considerations when you're submitting your grant. The reviewing IRB should be selected prior to submitting your proposal. There is not a requirement that the lead site serve as the IRB, but the lead site is responsible for identifying their proposed IRB at the time of grant submission for NIH or other HHS-funded entities. Other HHS-funded research. The plan for single IRB for NIH must be submitted at the time of the grant submission. There is no requirement for an institutional authorization agreement to be signed prior to the application, and in fact, most institutions, including VCU, will not sign an authorization agreement at that time, but the applicant should be able to provide documentation indicating that there is willingness to review or rely with each of the collaborators. So this means that before you submit that grant, you should have a conversation with the VCU IRB and with your other collaborators to ensure that their institutions are willing and able to adhere to that single IRB requirement. The NIH does expect that many single IRBs will charge fees to review for other sites. The inclusion of these fees in the budget is the responsibility of the lead site and should be included in the grant budget. This is a new responsibility. The single IRB plan gets uploaded as an attachment to question 3.2 of the new Forms E for NIH submissions and must include a statement that awardees will comply with the requirement, the name of the IRB identified as the reviewing IRB, an overview of the communication plan, an indication that all sites have agreed to sign an IAA, and which institution will maintain records of institutional authorization agreements and communication plans. Do not include your institutional authorization agreement or your communication plan with your grant application. You just need to be able to communicate to the funder that you will have these documents in place if you're awarded the grant. Any agreement to review or to seed review at the time of grant submission is preliminary. The VCU investigator must still obtain appropriate reviews and approvals through RAMS IRB prior to any involvement of the human subjects at VCU. So when you're ready to request a reliance, you need to obtain agreement from all sites. This is the responsibility of the lead site. When VCU is going to be the lead site on a grant that's being submitted to HHS or NIH, it is strongly advised that you reach out to IRB Reliance at vcu.edu ahead of time so that you can get some assistance in contacting those potential relying or reviewing sites and get your documentation in place prior to submitting your grant. When you reach out, please provide the name and contact information for your proposed reviewing IRB, a brief overview of your study design, and importantly, a description of VCU's role in the research. The decision about whether to rely is oftentimes contingent upon the actual work that's happening here at VCU. So it's crucial that you include that information in your response. Again, this email request should be submitted at least 2 weeks before your grant is due to OSP or prior to your submission in the RAMS Reliance. As the IRB Reliance Specialist, I can help you make a preliminary determination about whether Reliance is appropriate, if it's not required, and determine whether the proposed site is willing to review and is qualified and meets VCU's requirements. When you're ready to request a reliance in RAMS IRB, you're going to start the study the same way you would start any study in RAMS IRB. But when you get to that IRB panel setup page as displayed on this screen, instead of selecting VCU IRB, you select either Western IRB, NCI Central, or Other IRB, and then type in the name of the institution you want to rely on when selecting Other. Making the selection here causes the smart form to only display those pages that are relevant to determining whether a Reliance agreement is appropriate and collecting the information necessary for ensuring that institutional compliance requirements are met for the research. When you're preparing your study submission in RAMS IRB, you should be prepared to upload the following documents: PIs or the medically responsible investigator's CB, study protocol if one's available, any informed consent forms and HIPAA authorizations that will be used at VCU. If the study's already been approved by the external IRB, upload your approval letter. If you're being asked to provide any local context forms, please go ahead and upload those at this point as well. And then documentation that verifies all of the applicable institutional approvals. So if institutional biosafety committee review or radiation safety committee review is required, we will not be able to complete out the institutional compliance screening until documentation of those approvals has been received. We'll also be looking for verification of your IND, IDE, or exemptions, drug brochures, inserts, or device instructions. When the study is industry-sponsored, there are some additional requirements. You'll be requested to provide a memo from OSP that verifies the injury clause language in the consent, confirmation of the sponsor's agreement to pay WIRB fees, and an index code for the VCU institutional compliance review fee. Once you've submitted your request to rely, someone in the VCU Office of Research Subjects Protections is going to determine that the PI is qualified, verify that all of your key research personnel have completed CITI, verify that COI review has been completed, conduct any HIPAA reviews when VCU continues to serve as the privacy board, and confirm that ancillary review approvals are in place. If required, we'll also check for PRMC approval, confirm that you have a data security plan in place, and other institutional requirements. Some of the common problems that come up when people submit these requests, they're missing documents. That's the big one. In particular, the OSP memo, but keep in mind that this memo is only required if the research is industry-sponsored. In the event that you have industry-sponsored research that's minimal risk, so for example, if you have a chart review study, we are still going to be looking for confirmation from OSP that subject injury language is not required. This can be just an email between you and your contact at OSP, but we do need some documentation that there is an exception here for that OSP memo. Another big issue that we run into often is an incomplete external IRB summary. Please specifically tell us what it is that VCU is doing. Again, this is information that we need in order to determine whether or not it's appropriate for VCU to rely on an external IRB. So if we're missing that information, we don't have everything that we need to make a determination about whether Reliance is appropriate in this case. As with any research that you're doing here at VCU, missing your basic city training, if your refresher training is out of date, or if your financial interest report is not up to date, is going to delay the screening of your submission. If at all possible, please try to request your ancillary reviews ahead of time. So for example, if you know that you are going to need Radiation Safety Committee review, it's appropriate to go ahead and reach out to Radiation Safety and get the ball rolling on that process before you submit to VCU via the RAMS system to request a Reliance. Oftentimes we're missing the index for industry-sponsored research. That will slow down or delay your institutional compliance screening. And then documentation of who is paying the commercial IRB, if you're using a commercial IRB. This can be an email between you and the sponsor, but we do need to see some documentation. And the reason for that is that VCU gets billed for the commercial IRB fees. We charge a 30% overhead. So we want to make sure that you've had this conversation with your sponsor before that happens. Some other considerations to keep in mind when you're relying on an external IRB: how much money is this going to cost you? As mentioned earlier in the presentation, NIH does allow for academic institutions now to charge for reviewing for relying sites. So this means even if you're not using a commercial IRB, there may still be fees that you need to account for. And if VCU is the lead site, you're responsible for ensuring that those fees are in the budget. You might also want to consider the experience of the proposed reviewing IRB and whether or not they have any history of reviewing the type of research that you're going to be submitting. Again, consider the adequacy of the reviewing IRB. Does your review require specific expertise like a prisoner representative? Are you including vulnerable populations? Things like that that you should account for. Keep in mind also that if you're relying on an external IRB, then you are following a different set of IRB policies. So you do still have to adhere to VCU's policies around research, but the review policies, the IRB policies, are going to be different. An example of this is the timeline for reporting. VCU requires that any instance of a potential unanticipated problem or serious or continuing noncompliance that involves risks to subjects or others be reported to the VCU IRB within 5 days. Other institutions may have set different timelines, and if you are subject to a 3-day turnaround time, it is your responsibility to know that. There are also differences in the definition of noncompliance. While unanticipated problem and serious and continuing noncompliance are defined by the federal regulations, general noncompliance is not. So you'll want to make sure that you're familiar with these policies at the institution that you're relying on for IRB review. It's also very important to make sure that you are able to maintain communication with the reviewing IRB. Whether the lead site is serving as an intermediary there or not, you need to have a channel to make sure that you can get information to them when you need to, and that you're getting information from the IRB communicated back to you in a timely manner. There are some ongoing responsibilities here at VCU. Some amendments to your study protocol must get local screening. So this is going to include your changes to key personnel. That includes the PI, the student investigator, any medically or psychologically responsible investigator, or other personnel whose roles are essential to the conduct of the research. If you're adding any previously undisclosed investigational drugs, biologics, or devices, that information needs to be submitted to VCU. If you're changing your use of PHI or the HIPAA pathway, particularly in cases where VCU continues to serve as the privacy board, that's information that must be submitted via the amendment process in the VCU RAMS IRB. If there's a change to your research funding or the study review type, for example, if it moves from expedited to exempt review, if there's any protocol change that triggers ancillary review, such as the addition of some radiation-producing procedure, or if you are changing IRBs, you must submit this information to the VCU HRPP for screening. You also need to submit any findings of unanticipated problem or serious or continuing noncompliance. In cases where the reviewing institution has not made a finding of unanticipated problem or serious or continuing noncompliance, you are not required to submit that report to the VCU HRPP. But when such a finding has been made, you should submit that information as quickly as possible to the VCU IRB. In cases where you're relying on an external IRB, they are more than likely going to be the entity responsible for reporting to the federal authorities. But VCU always ensures that we have an opportunity to review the letter and to request changes for their consideration before it gets submitted. If the reviewing IRB decides not to accept our changes, we can also oftentimes submit our own letter. So if you have a finding of an anticipated problem or serious or continuing noncompliance, keep in mind that the VCU HRPP is your ally in this case. We're here to help you and can oftentimes provide some input on the letter that goes to the federal authorities. You're also required to cooperate fully with any post-approval monitoring that VCU conducts. So the majority of agreements do stipulate that we maintain a post-approval monitoring program and that external studies that are reviewed by an external IRB continue to receive post-approval monitoring here at VCU. And then we ask that you update the submission annually or at the time of continuing review and at closure. And this is really to ensure that VCU has an accurate accounting of all of the research that's happening here at our institution. So in the event that you are transferring your research from one IRB to another, you must notify the VCU IRB of your intention to do so, and preferably notify us well ahead of time. There's a specific policy in place, or excuse me, a specific process in place when you're transferring from the VCU IRB to an external IRB. The first step is going to be to notify VCU by emailing irbReliance@vcu.edu and include your current VCU HM number. You can then create and submit your RAMS Reliance request as described earlier in this presentation. But on the study identification page, please be sure to associate your previous VCU IRB reviewed studies HM number right there in question 5 where the arrow is pointing to. You're also going to be asked to associate that HM number on the IRB panel setup page. And note that this study is a study transfer. This seems redundant, but the reason for this is that our system right now is not set up to store this information in a way that's useful for VCU and to connect those protocols. However, that change is coming. So until the system has been updated, we need to have this information collected in both places to ensure that the studies are linked. Do not close the VCU study. Do not submit a closure request for the VCU study. The VCU study must be kept open until after compliance screening is complete and the VCU site has been approved by your new IRB. This is to ensure no break in your research while you're transferring from VCU IRB to another IRB. When you've logged the approval from the new IRB using the approved by external IRB activity, send an email to irbReliance@vcu.edu that includes both the VCU IRB HM number and the new HM number associated with your Reliance request, and confirm that the new IRB has approved VCU as a site. The VCU HRPP will then administratively close the old study. The old study cannot be closed via the usual process because VCU must maintain records for studies that the IRB has reviewed that are still ongoing at VCU for 6 years after their closure. Because of the way our system is currently set up, if we do not close these studies administratively, there is the potential that our records will be purged before that 6-year timeline has been met. So it is incredibly important that we do not close the old study via those normal processes, but rather use this administrative process to close that out. So how can I help you get through this process? Well, at the time of your initial determination for a Reliance arrangement, I can help you figure out whether the reviewing IRB is adequate, if the request is in line with VCU policies, and if so, provide you with a letter of support for your grant submission. And when you're ready to submit, help you make contact with your proposed reviewing IRB and start that Reliance Agreement process. During the institutional compliance screening, we'll be checking for institutional policy requirements, requesting any ancillary reviews that you haven't already requested, and then assist you with completing local context and institutional profiles. So if you receive a local context form that you need to complete, don't feel like this is something that you need to take on yourself. It's going to be asking you about state laws, institutional requirements for consent procedures, and things like that that we're really well versed in picking out. So if you get a request for a local context form, don't hesitate to send that our way. We're more than happy to help you with completing that. And then we'll also often be responsible for conducting your privacy board review and approving waivers or partial waivers of authorization. We also facilitate the execution of the Reliance Agreement, and that includes executing Reliance Agreements through IRB Exchange. Anyone who's used IRB Exchange before knows that there's a lot of information that's required, and the VCU HRPP is well equipped to help you get that information in there. Throughout the study, throughout the life of your study, we can help you in the event that you aren't able to get a response from the lead study team or the IRB. Give us a call. Our Reliance Agreements all include specific information about the responsibilities of the reviewing IRB to provide documentation related to IRB review to VCU or to the VCU study team. If you're having a hard time getting a response, we may be able to have a little more success. If you have a reportable event, we might be able to provide some input on the letter to authorities. And then we can also give you some guidance on your ongoing responsibilities here at VCU, or help you with getting applicable policies from the reviewing institution if you're not able to do so through their provided contact person. Just some key points to take away from this presentation. Early communication really is crucial here. Please involve IRB Reliance at vcu.edu earlier in order to prevent delays later. For example, if you submit a request to rely on an external IRB for an exempt study that is not required to rely on an external IRB, there is a very strong possibility that after a couple of weeks of sitting in queue, you're going to be told that we can't rely. And this is because a majority of institutions will not execute a reliance agreement for exempted research, and VCU will not rely on another IRB without a reliance agreement in place, including for exempted research. So don't waste your time submitting something through RAM's IRB that's ultimately going to be denied. Go ahead and reach out ahead of time, and I can help you make that determination about whether or not it's appropriate. Make sure that you submit complete and accurate requests in order to avoid delays, and if possible, reach out to those ancillary review committees ahead of time to try to get that process started. Make sure that you're submitting all of the required information after approval. This is an ongoing responsibility. And then be sure to check the IRB Reliance webpage for updates. Here are some additional resources that you might find useful. There's a link to the 2018 Common Rule that also includes the single IRB requirement that was effective January 20th, 2020. There are city program tips for single IRB. The Smart IRB resources page is incredibly helpful, even in cases where you're not using where you're not using Smart to document the single IRB. They have resources that include communication plan templates, and documents to specify any flexible terms of the Reliance Agreement that can be very useful. And then again, the VCU Reliance website will have updates. In the event that you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. My email is irbReliance@vcu.edu, and phone number is 827-1446. I'm always happy to answer any questions and to help you get started in this process. Thank you so much.